Why would Pope Leo XIV personally ask for one statue to leave Fatima and come to Rome? Not a replica, not a ceremonial substitute. The original statue of Our Lady of Fatima, carved from cedar wood, kept in the chapel of the apparitions, and rarely moved from the shrine that has guarded it for more than 1 century. At first glance, it appears serene, almost simple, but inside its history is a chain of children, popes, war, thanksgiving, consecration, and one piece of metal that was meant to kill. In October 2025, that statue stood again before the world during the Jubilee of Marian Spirituality in Rome, at the personal request of Pope Leo XIV. Before it, he offered the first golden rose of his pontificate. Before it, he consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The question is not only why this statue came to Rome. The deeper question is why, across generations, the successors of Peter keep returning to the same wooden image from Fatima when the world enters an hour of fear. In October 2025, the heart of Rome became the center of a Marian moment that was not ordinary. For 2 days, the original statue of Our Lady of Fatima stood before the faithful during the Jubilee of Marian Spirituality. This was the same statue normally kept in the chapel of the apparitions at the shrine of Fatima. It had come to Rome because Pope Leo XIV personally requested it. On the first evening, during a vigil for peace, the Holy Father offered the first golden rose of his pontificate before the statue. The gesture carried centuries of papal meaning, a rare honor given to churches, sanctuaries, royalty, and governments. The next day, before the same image, he consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Peace, unity, and hope were placed before a statue that had carried the prayers of millions. This was not a simple transfer of a religious object from Portugal to Rome. It was a public act with historical weight. The Pope did not ask for just any Marian image. He asked for the original statue of Fatima, the one almost never moved, the one tied to apparition, war, papal survival, and a bullet hidden inside a crown. The question begins with movement. Why call this statue away from Fatima when the Catholic world already has countless images of Mary, countless replicas, and countless shrines? The answer starts with the fact that this was not one of the pilgrim statues made to travel. This was the original image, the one normally kept close to the place where the apparitions were remembered. For more than 1 century, the statue had remained tied to the shrine of Fatima with unusual restraint. It did not move for ordinary devotion, public curiosity, or ceremonial convenience. When it left the sanctuary, the departure itself became a sign that something larger was being marked. Each journey carried a weight beyond geography. That is why Pope Leo XIV's request mattered. He was not asking Rome to receive a beautiful work of sacred art. He was asking for the presence of an image connected to Fatima's deepest memory, to papal consecrations, to world crisis, and to a history that had repeatedly drawn the successors of Peter back toward Mary. To understand that request, the story has to return to the beginning. The story began in 1917, far from the center of Rome, in Fatima, where 3 shepherd children said they saw a lady brighter than the sun. Their names were Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. What they described would later become one of the most recognized Marian apparitions in the modern history of the Church. But before basilicas, papal visits, and global processions, there were only children, a field, and a message that would not remain local. A few years later, in 1920, a devoted believer from Fatima named Gilberto Fernandez dos Santos commissioned an artist to make the image visible. The sculptor was José Ferreira Thedem, and the instruction was not based on imagination alone. He carved the Virgin, according to Lucia's own description, before the Church had formally approved the apparitions. The material was cedar wood from Brazil, shaped into a figure that was delicate, restrained, and immediately recognizable. That origin matters because the statue did not begin as a Vatican project. It was born before official approval, from the devotion of those who believed Fatima had been touched by heaven. The image came from the people before it stood before popes. Its authority began in a local act of faith. The statue was placed in the small chapel of the apparitions, close to the place where the children's testimony had first taken root. It stood there not as a museum object, but as a silent witness to pilgrims who came with prayers, tears, conversions, and hope. Over time, the chapel became more than a location. It became the center of a devotion that moved outward from Fatima into the wider Catholic world. What made the statue powerful was not artistic grandeur alone. It carried the memory of ordinary believers who had loved Our Lady before the world had fully understood Fatima. Their faith came first, then the recognition, then the crowds, then the history. The image stood at the center of all of it, quiet and unmoving. From that humble chapel, devotion to Our Lady of Fatima spread across nations. Pilgrims came, messages were carried, and the statue remained where the first trust of the people had placed it. It was no longer only cedar wood shaped by an artist. It had become a visible sign of a faith that millions would eventually recognize. In the 1940s, the statue received another mark of devotion, and again it came through the faith of ordinary people. On May 13, 1946, the image of Our Lady of Fatima was solemnly crowned with a crown of gold, pearls, and precious stones. It was not offered as decoration alone. It came through the initiative of Portuguese women who wanted to give thanks. Their thanksgiving was tied to the Second World War. They offered the crown because their husbands and sons had been spared from the devastation that had consumed so much of the world. What rested above the statue's head was therefore not only precious metal and jewels. It was fear survived, families preserved, and gratitude made visible. But that crown would later receive something no one could have imagined in 1946. It had been shaped by love and thanksgiving. But decades later, it would hold an object marked by violence. A bullet would enter the story, and once it did, the meaning of the statue would become inseparable from the fate of a pope. From its earliest days, the original statue of Our Lady of Fatima was never treated like an image meant to travel constantly. Many pilgrim statues were created for that mission, but this one remained at the shrine, close to the chapel of the apparitions. In more than one century, it left Fatima only 14 times. Each departure was rare enough to become part of the story itself. Among those journeys, Rome became one of the most important destinations. In 1984, the statue came to Rome when Pope John Paul II consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In 2000, it returned when he entrusted the new millennium to her. In 2013, Pope Francis welcomed it during the Marian Year of Faith. Then came October 2025, when Pope Leo XIV requested it for the Jubilee of Marian Spirituality. The sequence was not accidental. Each journey placed the statue before the Church at a moment of consecration, transition, or renewed appeal for peace. This is why its movement mattered so much. When the original statue left Fatima, the Church understood that the gesture carried more than distance. The bond between this statue and the papacy became even more mysterious through the third secret of Fatima. In that vision, the children spoke of a bishop, dressed in white, who suffered for the faith. For many Catholics, that image seemed to point toward the Pope himself. The meaning became harder to ignore on May 13, 1981. That day, gunfire broke through St. Peter's Square, and Pope John Paul II was struck down. The date was the anniversary of the first apparition at Fatima. The Pope survived, and later he said that one hand had pulled the trigger, but another had guided the bullet. A year later, he traveled to Fatima to thank the Virgin for his life. When John Paul II consecrated the world in 1984, he sent that same bullet to Fatima as an offering. The shrine's goldsmiths placed it into the crown that had been given in 1946. Then they discovered the detail that made the story impossible to forget. The bullet fit perfectly into the small opening at the center of the crown, as if violence itself had been absorbed into a sign of protection. The same wooden statue drew the successors of Peter toward Fatima across decades. Pope Paul VI became the first pope to visit Fatima in 1967, marking the sanctuary with a papal presence that gave the devotion new public weight. Pope John Paul II returned there more than once, including in 1991 and in 2000, when he beatified the shepherd children. His bond with Fatima had already been sealed by survival, gratitude, and the bullet placed inside the crown. Pope Benedict XVI knelt before the statue in 2010. Pope Francis came in 2017, during the centenary of the apparitions, and canonized Francisco and Jacinta while praying at her feet. Each pope arrived with his own history, his own burden, and his own reason for standing before that image. But the pattern remained clear. This was not only devotion repeated across pontificates. It was a line of popes returning to the same Marian sign at decisive moments in modern church history. Before this statue, the papacy seemed to recognize something larger than memory. It recognized a mission tied to prayer, protection, and the maternal heart of the Church. So the story returns to October 2025, when Pope Leo XIV looked toward Fatima in the first months of his pontificate. The world around him was marked by conflict, uncertainty, and a hunger for peace that no institution could ignore. He did not ask for a replica or a symbolic substitute. He asked for the original statue, the cedarwood image that had watched over pilgrims, consecrations, papal gratitude, and the strange silence of a bullet inside a crown. When the statue arrived in Rome for the Jubilee of Marian Spirituality, the gesture carried the weight of every journey before it. Pope Leo offered the golden rose before her, the first of his pontificate. Then he consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, placing humanity's unrest before the same Marian image that had stood at the center of Fatima for more than 1 century. It was not ceremony emptied of meaning, it was continuity made visible. That is why this statue and no other was requested. It carried the memory of 1917, the faith of the people, the thanksgiving of Portuguese women, the wound of John Paul II, and the repeated trust of the popes who came before Leo. By calling it to Rome, Pope Leo XIV did not create a new story. He stepped into an old one that was still unfinished. The story behind the statue Pope Leo XIV requested is not only the story of cedarwood carved into the image of Our Lady of Fatima, it is the story of 3 shepherd children in 1917, a local believer in 1920, a crown offered in 1946, and a bullet sent to Fatima after a pope survived death in St. Peter's Square. Every layer remained there, silent, until another pope asked the statue to come to Rome. That is what made the request so powerful. Pope Leo XIV was not reaching for decoration. He was reaching for memory, intercession, protection, and continuity. From Fatima to Rome, from the hearts of children to the heart of the papacy, this statue has carried the prayers of a church that keeps returning to Mary when history becomes uncertain. And in October 2025, before the original statue of Our Lady of Fatima, Pope Leo XIV placed the world once again under the Immaculate Heart of Mary.